Hello. So, I have just finished reading a surprising book that has been described as a quintessential cyberpunk book. It's Metrophage by Richard Kadrey. Apparently, he's better known for a supernatural series, Sandman Slim novels from the 2000s. I hadn't heard of them. I'm pretty sure I haven't read them. I don't read a lot of supernatural. I have read the Benedict Jacker books and enjoyed them and Jim Butcher, but it's not something I seek out. Now, Metrophage and great cover, very cyberpunk, ended up on my bookshelf from a sale, and I think it was probably the Lifeline Book Fair, actually. It's a VGSF, which is an imprint of Victor Golant's, and it's copyrighted from 1988, so that's pretty old, but it's right from the middle of the cyberpunk era. Wikipedia describes it as first published in 1988. It is a cyberpunk novel set in a dystopic future Los Angeles. It's been referred to in reviews as one of the quintessential 1980s cyberpunk novels. And I feel a little bit meh about the fact that I hadn't read it or indeed heard of it before, because in the early 90s, cyberpunk was a very big one for me. I discovered William Gibson. I read a lot in the genre. My then boyfriend and I discovered the cyberpunk role-playing game, and cyberpunk was a very big one for me for quite a few years. Loved the William Gibson novels. Really liked Metrophage, but it took me a long time to get into. So it's been on my shelf for quite some time. I'd pick it up, I'd read a few pages. I couldn't get into it. This time when I picked it up, even though I didn't instantly get sucked in, I persevered until around about page 20, not even page 20. So maybe 15 or 16, I was definitely getting sucked in, and by the time I hit 30, there was no way I was giving it up. I was loving it. There's so much to talk about with Metrophage. In terms of world building, I think it compares actually very well to William Gibson's Sprawl series. Like I said, I loved William Gibson. I don't believe Neuromancer was my first William Gibson. I think Count Zero was my first one, but there was also Neuromancer, Mona Lisa Overdrive, all of those, I loved them. The world building is extensive there, but as far as I know, Kadrey only wrote this one cyberpunk novel, so he's got a huge amount of world building that he only really uses in this one novel. The world building is based around LA. There's a number of nicknames given to LA throughout it. All of them are pretty non-complimentary. Kadrey has built a magnificent quintessential cyberpunk background. So cyberpunk was science fiction, but it was a particular amalgam of science fiction. You had almost always some element of dystopian world or street smarts. So cyberpunk comes from the punks on the street. More of an 80s or 90s phrase than you'd hear around these days. But basically a street punk being any sort of gangstery-ish, drug-ish, violence-ish type person. The cyber comes from that there was a lot of technology. William Gibson concentrates a lot on the web and the internet and people who are plugging into the internet. There is an element of that to Metrophage because you've got people who are plugged in some way, but an overall World Wide Web isn't mentioned. There's also a huge biological element. In any cyberpunk, you've got a lot of body modifications and usually chemical stimulus as being used in some way or another, and the drug scene is very heavy in Metrophage. So that's your setting. Our main character is Johnny, and when it starts, Johnny is saying goodbye to his girlfriend. He's off looking for a particular person, and he plans to kill him because the person he's looking for is called Easy Money, and he's got horn implants, look like a devil, and apparently a clubfoot. Johnny is after Easy Money because Easy Money killed a friend of Johnny's during some sort of a drug deal and stole his merchandise. Johnny himself is a little bit of a drug dealer and a little bit of a runner. An all-around punk, street punk. We don't get the sense that he's unusual. The book refers a lot to the 1%, which is like the 1% of people who are... I don't know how they came to the 1%, but it's the ordinary people on the street who don't have very much and are just getting by. And that is what Johnny sort of represents himself as. But throughout the novel, we get hints that build up more and more that Johnny is considerably more than just any old punk. He himself has almost no inner life, and for a while there I thought that Johnny was going to be a kind of character like William Gibson uses Case, a completely anonymous blank slate of a man who is a character around which the plot happens. And at first it feels that way with Johnny because there's a lot of very vivid characters. He himself is not a very vivid character. He comes across as basic without a huge inner life, and he doesn't have a lot of introspection, and he doesn't double think things. But the more we get to know him, the more we realize there's more and more to him, and we realize that through the very vivid characters around him. So first of all, he goes to the club looking for Easy Money, but Easy Money is on the run and lots of other people are looking for him. Then there's a sector where he is captured by the committee, as it is called. And the colonel of the committee is a name beginning with Z, which I've forgotten. So I keep thinking Zambreros, but that's a restaurant. Zamora, that's it. Colonel Zamora has sent the committee after Johnny. The committee started off with the name of the Committee of Public Health, but what they actually are is a more violent, more drug-fueled version of cops. The cops are a bit of a joke. That also often happens in cyberpunk. Here we've got the committee. They're a lot more militant. They concentrate on taking young teenagers. One gathers that a 16 or 17-year-old is already getting a bit old for their ranks. And they have some sort of regulatory but very corrupt role. And we find out that Zamora's after Johnny because Johnny used to be in the committee. He signed out, but when he signed out, he also shot someone he didn't like on the way out. So through that character we learn there's this other aspect to Johnny, and Johnny never really responds very much to it, but he gets beaten up a lot by Zamora and by the committee. Zamora sets him free because he wants Johnny to sell out a guy who is one of the drug lords. His name begins with C, Conover. Now Johnny's run drugs for him before and he's worked with him before and has a good relationship with Conover. Zamora sends him out to capture Conover and bring him into the colonel, and he's got 24 hours to do it. Unfortunately, when he leaves, he has been beaten so badly that he basically stumbles down into the sewers and collapses for 20 hours. While he's there, he's taken care of by the Croakers, which are the undercover version of doctors. So in the cyberpunk role-playing game that we played, there was a lot about Ripperdocs. A Ripperdoc was basically the street-level doctor that anyone can afford. They may have a lot of qualifications but have been discredited. They may have street-level qualifications, but it's not a doctor in the social sense of the word. It's someone who can do biological things, even if it's just installing wetware or taking out your eye and replacing it with a cybernetic eye, things like that. The Croakers have got a whole anarchy rebellion thing happening, and through them we meet another really interesting character who helps flesh out Johnny's character. Around about that time, without anything being said, we really realise that Johnny can't really be the pig ignorant street person. He claims he knows way too much about nerves, chemicals, things that go into macrophages, and that's when the disease element comes in. There's this huge, horrible, zombifying disease that's obviously a biological weapon that's been created by humanity and is being leashed on the city of Los Angeles, this future LA. So Johnny leaves the doctoring, even though he's found an ex-girlfriend there, because he wants to go and find his old girlfriend who he's saying farewell to at the beginning of the book, and he's worried about her. And then eventually we meet Conover, and then he finally catches up with Easy Money, only to find out that Easy Money has sold him out to this other character who is a really good character. So this woman, whose name I will certainly... Easy Virtue? No, not Negotiable Virtue either. Something about Virtue. Nimble Virtue? Yes, Nimble Virtue, that was it. Is a woman who grew up on the moon as a prostitute or comfort woman or something. And when these space aliens that everyone's talking about, but no one really knows how true it is or what they are, invaded the moon, she was forced to come to Earth, but because her skeleton was used to no gravity or low gravity, she has to wear basically the sort of thing you think of Ripley wearing in Alien, mechanoid to help her bones along, and her diaphragm and lung rib cage aren't strong enough, so she has something breathing for her. She's a middle-aged Japanese woman who's also now a drug lord. You see, you've got all these amazing characters and they all interact, and Johnny jumps from one to the other, getting beaten up every single time. Whenever he finds a safe refuge, he leaves it to go and get beaten up by someone else. And at some point, at least, I started wondering if Johnny hasn't noticed that an awful lot of people are very, very interested in him and start to wonder why. Now, we as the readers find out why eventually, but really that plot of why they're all after Johnny, what's happening with the zombie drug, and how all these different characters interact and affect Johnny's life, that's almost secondary to the background. And that's something you also often see in cyberpunk. You'll have a really vibrant, strong plot with lots of violence and drugs and bad stuff happening. But really the setting is the most vibrant thing about it, and that's definitely the case here. Johnny's unusual in that as a character he starts out as basic, a catalyst, if you will, for the story. As the story advances, without actually having character development, you find out more and more about him and he becomes more and more fascinating, but the world itself is taking you over as well, and that also is fascinating. Some of the descriptions are absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I'll read this one. So here we are on page 212, and he kept flashing on recording of Ice's face. The moment she saw his cat eyes, when she kissed him in the forest as she lay dying. He had not yet accepted that she could really be dead, and he knew that that was good. Barely functional as he was now, Johnny understood that some animal survival mechanism in his brain had cut in during the course of the last few hours, pumping him full of specific neural inhibitors, preventing him from accepting the true nature of his loss. He knew it was there, though, the loss. He imagined that he could feel it like a sack of poison lodged at the back of his skull, ready to burst when all this was over. So that's a taste of the kind of writing that you get. And it can be very elaborate, very beautiful, and very descriptive. It's an interesting sort of novel. I've read quite a bit of sci-fi. Well, I've read a heap of sci-fi. I've read quite a bit of cyberpunk and sci-fi that edges around the cyberpunk era. And I don't know that I've ever read anything quite like this. It's got elements of lots of other novels, but it's so incredibly fleshed out. It's almost as though the author, Richard Kadrey, had played 100 cyberpunk role-playing games and everyone got together to make this book out of a whole heap of the different runs. I looked online briefly to see if that was the case. I think everyone who plays cyberpunk at least one stage thinks this would make a great novel before they realise how much effort goes into writing a book. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. If anyone knows, I'd love to hear if this is based on actual role-playing. It feels that way. Now, there's something about cyberpunk that I often feel, and it's really random, so bear with me here. I feel that to an extent, cyberpunk has a poetic element which reminds me of none other than T.S. Eliot. Now, I'm not for a second claiming that T.S. Eliot in the 1930s was writing cyberpunk, but to get that real spirit of cyberpunk, you need a almost wistful, almost poetic element, and combining that poetic with the violence and the aggression and the drugs and bad things happening and people having their arms replaced by neurally interfaced guns and things like that, that kind of is the soul of cyberpunk for me. And when I was reading Metrophage in a few places, I thought of T.S. Eliot, and Richard Kadrey actually has a couple of quotes from A Sweet Little Bullet from a Pretty Blue Gun, which I gather is a song by Tom Waits. I'm not sure what or who Tom Waits is. I feel I've heard the name before, but there's a few quotes from him. One of them is, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I hear the sirens in the street. All my dreams are made of chrome, I have no way to get back home." That's right at the beginning of the book, and there's a few other ones in there that are really good. So that same poetic element really reminds me of one of my favourite poems by Eliot, which is the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And you can tell that it's kind of a favourite, can't you? This book isn't going to last forever. So right in the first paragraph, you've got this: "When the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table, let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit." And that to me is very cyberpunk. Do not ask what is it, just go along for the ride, because the ride is at least half of the pleasure of the cyberpunk. So you just make the visit. And the elements that he's drawing into this poem are all very cyberpunk to me. Half-deserted streets, muttering retreats, one-night cheap hotels, stereotyped restaurants with oyster shells. All of these things, in slight moderation, are all things that make cyberpunk very atmospheric, very engrossing, and a very, very rich world-building situation. And I've got to say, I think Metrophage definitely comes in as one of the better cyberpunk books I've read. I'm definitely hanging on to this one. I've been thinking of doing a reread of all the William Gibsons that I can get my hands of sometime soon. And after I've done that, I might come back to this one and see how it compares in nearer to the reading of Gibson, who has always been my gold standard cyberpunk up to now. Anyway, really glad I kept this one around on the bookshelf. I'm really glad I finally got into it. If you're trying to read it and you're finding it difficult to get through those first 5 pages because the characters seem flat, bear with it. It'll take you somewhere interesting, I'm pretty sure. Well, it took me there anyway.